Smoke, mirrors, and the truth. DeLorey, Anderson in the house, coming right up. And hello there, Bruce Anderson and Fred DeLorey are with us. I'm Peter mansbrIdge. This is Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth.
I think the contract says that it's supposed to be Anderson DeLorey. Isn't that right?
It's supposed to be alphabetical. Is that the idea?
No, I think it's a top billing thing. I mean, he's a rookie still. All right, let's go.
All right. Okay, French language debate for the Liberal leadership hopefuls last night. I'm looking at the headlines in the morning papers, and these are just the English language papers. I'll concede that, but here they are. CBC, Liberal leadership hopefuls pitch themselves as best person to take on Trump. The Globe, Liberal leadership contenders focus on Trump's threats to Canadian economy, sovereignty, and French debate. The Post, the National Post, first Liberal leadership debate offers little to distinguish between the candidates. And finally, the Star, Trump and his threats are the dominant topic at federal Liberal leadership candidates debate. None of that sounds overly interesting, but that's what it is. And if you were expecting fireworks, they're not in those headlines. There's an opinion piece in the Globe, which may sum it up better, Campbell Clark. Even with his gaffes, Carney's still the front runner after the French debate. Okay, we convene the spin room, our spin room. Fred, of course, works for Doug Ford in the upcoming provincial election, which we'll get to in a little bit. And Bruce is working along with Mark Carney on the Liberal leadership debate. So what's your headline? What's your headline, Fred?
Oh, wow. Well, I really, I think Campbell Clark hit it quite well in terms of how Mark Carney has this race sewn up. There is no real competition here. And I say this as a conservative who's gone through, we've had 3 leadership races in like 5 or 6 years where Max Bernier was going to win one of those and then lost. Peter MacKay was going to win the next one, then lost. So front runners do lose. But then I remember the third one, Pierre Poilievre crushed everybody and ran away with it. This feels like that sort of race where it's not a race at all. There's no real competition in this. But the gaffes is what jumped out at me, both with what Campbell Clark wrote in the Globe and Mail and then what happened last night. And the gaffes were mostly, it was language based. And French is a hard language to command when you're an Anglophone. And I'm not going to criticize his French per se, but I think it was the expectations. I expected, and the way it was presented to us, that Mark Carney is this brilliant man, the smartest man in Canada. He is a master of everything, economics, French, the language. His French was not at the expectation that his own team, I think, had set. And when you fail to meet expectations, that's when problems begin to arise. And I think people will begin to question how legitimate is this person. So I think it was a bit of a letdown in so many ways for him and his team.
Bruce, how do you respond to that, and how do you put your own spin on last night?
Well, look, I think that you read 3 or 4 headlines, Peter. 3 of them mentioned Trump, and I think from the standpoint of what the Liberal Party is trying to do through the course of this race is to say this is the issue. This is the issue that should be talked about. So, some observers who are looking to score this as a boxing match or that sort of thing, and might say, well, that doesn't sound that interesting. To the vast majority of voters, that is the only issue that is interesting to them. And to set up an election where the contrast between Pierre Poilievre, who has a lot of supporters who support Donald Trump, he's in quite a difficult position, and have those Liberal leadership aspirants all saying Trump is the threat. How we deal with it, maybe we differ a little bit, but it is the subject of the discussion. So I think from that standpoint, there was something accomplished there for the Liberal aspirants and probably for the Liberal Party relative to Mr. Poilievre's conservative proposition. The second thing, so the National Post said there was nothing to distinguish those people. I don't think that was right at all. There were things that they agreed on, which is hardly surprising since they're all in the same party. But to say that Karina Gould was exactly the same as Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, to me, just didn't sum up what I saw last night. And on Fred's point about language, I'm somebody who grew up as an Anglophone who learned how to speak French in Valleyfield, and I could probably have a 20-minute debate where I wouldn't, completely mess up. I could kind of carry it on that long, but it's long to do that for that length of time. And I actually think that the level of French, including by Mark Carney, I think that Francophones in Quebec probably measure it not on the basis of was it as good as some pundits might have suggested that it was going to be. I don't think that's the measure at all. I think that it's, did he and the others sound like they were trying to have a real conversation in the French language with Quebec voters? And I think they all passed that test, to be honest. I really do.
Let me deconstruct the one main gaffe for a minute, because I find talking about it somewhat interesting. The issue is around the Middle East. And at one point, when Carney was going through the various attitudes toward the Middle East situation, he was talking about Hamas. And it was clear from what he was saying that everybody on that stage was against Hamas. And that's been clear all along. And nobody's really questioned that. But in his wrap up to it, in French, it came across, we all agree avec Hamas, with Hamas, as opposed to against Hamas. Now, it was a slip. It was, an issue of syntax, I guess. But it was that, nevertheless. And the Conservatives, Fred, had an ad out with literally within minutes on social media to take advantage of that. Now, I guess all's fair in love and war, but is there anybody who actually thinks that Mark Carney or anybody on that stage is with Hamas?
Well, he said it. These are his words. Like that's the problem with this, is that that's exactly what he said. All they had to do was clip what he said. It's not like, does he believe it or not? I don't know. He said it. Now, we say it's a slip and a gaffe, and it was. I don't believe he thinks that way, just to be clear. But the fact that he said it, it is all fair in love and war. This is a political, in the House of Commons, the opposition and the government sit 2 sword lengths away from each other. This is a civilized war in politics that we have, and it's a part of our democracy. So if you make a slip like that, if you say something that messed up, it's going to be used against you, no question. But again, to the point that I was trying to make earlier, to me, it's about expectations. I expected him to be able to command the language better because of what was presented in front of me of who this person is. I understand the language is hard, and I don't fault people for not being able to speak it. That's not where I'm coming from on this. But for him and his team, I think it's a problem because it's now a chink in the armor where we're seeing where maybe he's not as strong as we thought he was.
Bruce?
Yeah, I thought Andrew Coyne had it right when he said that people who are trying to make this into a gaffe, it has the odor, I think he said, of a flop sweat, implying that it's kind of desperate for, his critics to be saying, look at what a terrible mistake he made, when everybody who is saying that knows that he didn't make a mistake, that his position wasn't as they're trying to describe it. All they're trying to do is the same thing that regular voters have been sick and tired of politicians doing forever, which is let me find 3 words put together in a certain way, frame them in an ad, and cause people to get enraged or be fearful or get confused or some combination of those things. And I'm not suggesting that's what Fred is doing, but Well, it's a cousin of that. It's not that far from what Fred is doing, to be
That's right.
honest, because Fred even goes on to say, I know he doesn't think that. Peter, you said, I know he doesn't think that. And all three of us will say things in the course of doing a podcast or making a presentation or giving a speech where we'll kind of flip a word around. And I saw it in real time, and I thought, yeah, somebody's going to try and make a meal out of this, but this is the least substantive meal of any gaffe I think I've ever heard told of. Because nobody who's paying attention and is kind of open-minded about this can come away thinking,
So
you know what, big revelation. He's for Hamas. I mean, that's silly.
again, I don't think anyone really thinks that. I think it just goes to the point of this guy. We really need to take a much closer look. When he did mess that sentence up, he did say we're all for Hamas. He said that. Yes, it was a mess. It was a gaffe. He didn't mean to say it, but he said it. And it's about that he messed up the language and said that. So we need to really look at how he communicates and what he's saying. And I think that is the issue here, because he's going to win this leadership. We're likely going right into an election, and you do not have many days in front of you in a campaign to make these sorts of gaffes. So
Let me ask you this question though, Fred, and I do this with great respect, obviously. I think it was the deputy leader of the Conservative Party used that slip of the tongue to make the case that Mark Carney is for Hamas.
Right.
I don't think that's responsible. I don't think that is. I mean, you can make the case that it's fair game. Everybody's always done that kind of thing. And he did say those words in that particular order. But she's a serious person, presumably. She's the deputy leader of the Conservative Party. She would be somebody significant in the context of a Poilievre government, I would assume. And she's very involved in the public conversation about the Middle East issues. So I don't know. I mean, if you ask me to sort of rank order the degree of unhappiness that I would have as a voter with him using those words in that way, incorrectly describing his actual position, but just in the moment, just in the heat of a debate, versus her saying, I'm going to tell people, I'm going to use my platform to tell people that he supports Hamas. I don't know. I think I know which one, for me anyway, is the bigger transgression.
Yeah, I think I think the point of it was that it was a gaffe. But on the other side too, there is a vote within the Liberal bloc that I think conservatives and many Canadians are concerned about, that there is this I don't want to say pro-Hamas, but this lean towards Hamas or Palestine, and not so much on the Israeli side of that debate that exists within the Liberal Party. So I think there's a bloc within the Liberal Party that may very much agree with Carney's slip up and with what he said. So I do absolutely think it's fair game to point that out. But again, to me, it's about the fact that he made a gaffe, and he's got such a short time to introduce himself going into this election that he can't afford these.
I just say one more thing on it. He did immediately correct himself, unchallenged, about the use of the word avec, the use of the word is or with, and he corrected himself and basically, made it clear that that's not what he had intended to do. Okay, I want one more question on the debate issue, and it's this: you can assume that the people who are going to be responsible for the federal debate, both broadcasters and parties, were watching last night to see whether there was something to learn from that particular model of a debate. Was there anything to learn from it? I mean, you two guys have witnessed debates over many years and many different campaigns. Did you forget about performances, the format? Was it a format that is something that should be looked at seriously for the federal debate? Bruce first.
Yeah, that's a good question, Peter. I haven't really thought about it very much, to be honest. I found myself watching it and thinking, first of all, French language debates involving mostly English politicians usually not going to be a great viewing experience for Anglophones or perhaps for Francophones. It's going to be a bit labored. So the format for me kind of fell into the background of just watching people try to do the right thing and express themselves in a language that wasn't their first choice, Baelish being their first language, Baelish being the exception, I think, to that rule. And so I didn't pay as much attention to the format, but I did kind of feel at a couple of times that the moderator was having trouble causing the right kind of interaction between the candidates and allowing it to develop in a way that was useful for the audience. So there was a lot of kind of broken back and forth that he stepped in and stopped. And there wasn't as much back and forth where you like to see an exchange, an extended exchange between candidates where they have a chance to debate each other and you get to see how they react when they're challenged one to the other. Now, the English language debate tonight should feature more of that, I think. And so we'll see. I also thought that the moderator was trying to do something interesting, kind of interrupting an answer with a follow-up question, making it a little bit more conversational like that. I can see some advantages to that in making it feel less overly formatted. But I don't know that it completely worked. I felt like it kind of disrupted the flow of the conversation sometimes, and it kind of made people who were, especially the three who were working in language that wasn't their first language, if it was me up there, I would have been unsettled by it. I wouldn't have felt like, oh, this is great. This is more conversation coming at me in a language that I'm working on. So I don't know. I don't think the format was a problem last night, and we've all seen debates at the federal election level where we walked away going, that was just a disaster. We never got to see what we wanted to see, and that wasn't that for me last night, but also I didn't think it worked as well as it might have.
Fred?
I find it fascinating that Canada's 158 years old and we're still continuing. The biggest debate we have with debates is the format for debates. We cannot seem to get it right. They're all just, and I think we have a multi-party system is what makes it different. We're also unique in that, we follow our American neighbors where they have two people on the stage. We have this Westminster political system, like in the UK and Australia, they don't have debates. They don't have leaders' debates. So we've Americanized ourselves by having this thing that is a core to us. We have to have them, we believe. And we still can't figure out how to do them. I remember the conservative leadership race that Pierre Poilievre won in 2022. The leadership debate there was an absolute travesty. It was so poorly done. It was embarrassing as a conservative at how they had these weird paddles you had to hold up if you wanted to interject. Tom Clark was the host. And at one point, they wanted no audience interaction at all. And when they would react early on in the debate, he threatened to shut down the whole debate as if he could even do that, as if this was some service he was providing. It was the strangest thing. So I can't knock the Liberals for trying this format. I think it was interesting, but it is fascinating to me that we still can't quite figure this out.
It still worked for Tom. He's in a multi-million-dollar condo in New York as the consul general.
So maybe he was in there to sabotage the Conservatives, and the Liberals gave him that sweet appointment.
Oh, Tom would never do that, but he did get carried away on the paddle issue. There's no doubt about that. Okay, shifting topics to our second and last topic for today, which is the Ontario election coming up in a couple of days. The Ontario legislature, for those in other parts of the country who don't know, has 124 seats. The Conservatives in the last election won, I think, about 80. If you listen to those who claim to know these things, the Conservatives, Doug Ford, could end up with close to 100 seats this time, which makes you wonder what kind of campaign this has really been. I mean, Ford portrayed the campaign as one to counter Donald Trump with, which is a puzzle on a number of fronts, seeing as provincial government really doesn't have anything to do with that relationship. Obviously, they have to protect jobs, etc. But that kind of a majority, is that good for democracy? Bruce, why don't you start? Because I know what Fred will say.
Well, look, I think the outcome is good for democracy because we're having a fair election and people are going to get to choose among the candidates that they want. So it's hard for me to kind of, say, well, democracy only really works if no party gets more than a certain threshold of seats. That our system is that first past the post system, and it's designed to be a competition that focuses on that outcome. And so I don't really have a view on that. I think the question of whether or not Ford should have called for an election, I think, is a pretty open question, but voters have been reluctant to kind of engage in that. They're preoccupied with the Trump impact on the economy and what to do about it. And his two main opponents have not really talked about that in the same way that he has, or haven't been as persuasive as he has. He's almost had the field to himself, I think, in terms of talking about that. But I also think the bigger question will be in the middle of a huge crisis that people are rightly concerned about. Is this going to be such a low turnout that we look at it and go, wow, how could that have happened? How could we have ended up in a situation where people are really quite worried about this situation and then don't bother to vote? Because I do think that Doug Ford planned to be a bit under the radar, planned to kind of run a campaign that people wouldn't notice that much, that would just kind of allow him to pick up another win, a very substantial win. And so if we just look at politics from the standpoint of the tactical choices, I think he's made a smart tactical choice. If we look at it from the standpoint of, did he have enough of a mandate to work with? I think the answer is obviously he did. But he chose to do this because he saw an opportunity. And, I feel it was cynical, just as I think giving people $200 just before an election campaign was cynical. But his opponents so far have not been able to kind of change the dynamic.
Fred, Bruce covered a lot of turf there.
He did. Where would you like me to start, Peter? Well, look, I think there's very good reason why the premier, and it's in his main message of why he called this election. He wants to be premier and have this government in place to deal with the entirety of the Trump government. Trump is going to be president for the next 4 years. It'll be good to have a stable Ontario government that can be in place for that entire time. And that's what this election will give us with whoever wins this. Obviously, I usually say no ballots have been cast yet when I talk federally, but there's actually been a lot of ballots cast because we've had 3 days of advance polls and returning offices are open. But at the end of the day, he is asking for a clear mandate. And it is a big deal when, Trump had just came out yesterday and said he is they're coming in March, these 25% tariffs across the board. 40% of Ontario's GDP is based on trade with the U.S. This is going to have a major, major impact on our province. And for Premier Ford, he wants that mandate that he could, as you said yourself, Peter, protect jobs, protect workers, protect our industries. There's going to be a lot of work to do on that. I know Premier Houston was in Ontario recently on that, talking about knocking down interprovincial trade. It's a big job. It's a focused job. It changes everything, right? Trump has changed the game so much. So to me, it makes perfect sense that he's gone to the people for a mandate to protect Ontario, to go back to the main slogan of the campaign. That's the focus of this. To the other parties, I don't know what they're running on. I don't know what the Liberals, and particularly the NDP.
Yeah, you're still there. We got you.
Okay, sorry. Can you still see me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Was that a gaffe?
It was a technical glitch.
He did say it.
He did say it. You're right. He did say it.
The NDP, I don't know what their message is in this campaign. I don't know where they are. I don't know what they're trying to get across to voters. This issue is the number one issue right now is affordability, and there's the concern of the Trump tariffs in terms of what people are worried about. And the other campaigns are not talking about any of those issues.
Okay. To be fair, Ford and your party was talking about an election before Donald Trump was elected in November. So that possibility always existed, no matter what the issue was. I mean, it was
That must have been a gaffe too, then, because they didn't want you to know that they were thinking about having an
Well,
election.
I think the media were speculating. I think there was a lot of media
yeah,
speculation.
based
I don't
on
recall the premier saying I
based
need an
on
election
what?
time. I
Well,
don't know.
yeah.
I don't know how you guys come up with your set.
Let me ask this as a final question. Does what happens on Thursday, on election day in Ontario, have any impact on the federal scene? Not just the Liberal leadership race, but on the federal scene, with the sense that we're going into an election fairly quickly, maybe very quickly, after the Liberals decide on who their leader is. Because I noticed that, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe I didn't notice it, but did Pierre Poilievre ever campaign with Doug Ford on this during this? Were they standing on the same stage together?
I'm not familiar with Poilievre campaigning on with any provincial leader. I think he's focused on federal stuff. There's been a number of provincial campaigns under his federal leadership, and I don't recall him being engaged. So it's not unusual.
But I'm sure if Doug Ford had asked him to be there, he probably would have been there.
Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's there's different topics, different jurisdictions of where they're fighting. And if you look at Ford's campaign, he's going to he's got an insane amount of union endorsements, and he's going to these workplaces. They're not the big stage rallies that we've seen in the past. It's been a different type of campaign in that regard, where he's going right to all these manufacturing places and meeting with workers. So
okay.
we're not having those big rallies.
All right, just to go back to the question I was trying to ask, and then I knocked you off course. But does it have an impact? Does the Ontario election result, whatever it is, will it have an impact on the national race?
I think the Ontario election and Ford's positioning in it is telling us a story that's relevant to the federal election campaign. It's a story of a politician who is the leader of a conservative party, but who has generally tried very hard to be a leader for a kind of a broad cross section of Ontario voters, who's tried to avoid the culture war aspect of what separates conservative voters from other voters. I don't want to give him a free pass on everything. I mean, there's some things that I would criticize, but we're not here to do that. You're asking a question about whether or not he's showing a version of how to succeed as a conservative politician in Ontario that Pierre Poilievre would be wise to emulate. Ford is more popular, I think, among Ontario voters than Pierre Poilievre is. And he's campaigning in a way that is more welcoming to voters outside of the core conservative base. Those are things that Pierre Poilievre didn't think he needed to do and has not really developed much of an appetite for, let alone a skill set for. Ford, on the other hand, I think spent the first year or so that he was in office looking like he was, well, maybe I'll try and do this Trump version. And he moved away from it. And I don't think he's ever gone back towards it. I think he's been quite disciplined about it. And disciplined, maybe not exactly the word I would use to describe Ford, but he's been pretty careful to make sure that mainstream voters don't see him as that kind of flip the table over populist. And I think that Pierre Poilievre is struggling with the fact that 40% of his voters want him to be and sound more like Trump or supportive of Trump. And the other 60% of his voters want him not to do that. And that, I think, is the central challenge that he's got, and that Ford is showing there's a way to do it. But I don't know that Pierre Poilievre is going to either embrace that way or be able to carry it out.
Fred, you get the last word.
It's a mighty challenge to be a federal conservative leader too, right? Like Ford is Premier of Ontario. He is absolutely focused on, the people, and that's always been, that's his authentic him, right? He really, really does care about people and what their focus and what their issues are. Poilievre, I think he's in a similar boat, but it's a different jurisdiction. It's the federal. You have all these other provinces and these other types of conservative out west that aren't the same as conservatives in Ontario necessarily. So you have this friction at times, and it's an immense challenge to be a federal Conservative Party leader, to keep the coalition together. It's such a fragmented coalition. There's so many different types of conservatism. I mentioned the Western Ontario. There's also Quebec and Atlantic Canada that has its other types of conservatism.
Yeah, Fred's done some really interesting work around, I think, what do you use your current count, 12 different types of conservative, or is it even more than that?
I think it's around 16.
Yeah.
That you can define yourself and you can chop up the conservative movement into who fits into what, and people identify as this type of conservative. So it's an immense challenge to be a federal conservative leader, to keep all of that together.
How many different kinds of liberals are there?
Maybe 3.
We'll
Was it corrupt,
talk
greedy?
about that sometime.
What's the
Easy now. Easy.
Well, it sounds like that could be a good conversation too. This has been a really good one. We appreciate your time, both of you. I know you got lots to do this week, and we'll check in again with you next week. Thanks again.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.